The FCC released an order in November 2011, like Angel said, known as the Universal Service and Intercarrier Compensation Transformation Order. Now this is a big statement in itself. Immediately after the order was filed, I mean immediately, within 30 days after the order was filed, and then up to probably 6 months, maybe 90 days, I'm not sure what the period was after that, there were about 30 different companies that filed a lawsuit against the SCC. And it's all over the board. It's price cap carriers, wireless carriers, I'm sure there's some satellite providers in there, there's some tribal nations in there, rate of return carriers. So this isn't something, I mean, it should speak volumes, because you would think that if the FCC had an agenda, they say, well, hey, we're gonna pinpoint this one agenda to recognize just this facet of the industry, but they didn't. I mean, basically what they did, I mean, what this is telling us is that they got it all wrong. Everything is wrong. So the order was supposed to address how the FCC was going to implement the National Broadband Plan, which was written by the FCC and approved by Congress. Part of the reforms is something called quantile regression analysis. You probably all heard the phrase, and actually maybe even experienced linear regression. Well, this is an offshoot of linear regression. So what happens, it's driven by statistics, mathematical coefficients, and benchmarks. And despite the fact that many FCC orders acknowledge that proxies and benchmarks don't work, is precisely what the FCC did in this case. So we're not saying that what the FCC did was necessarily wrong to maybe look at the outliers. If there are truly high-cost companies out there, hey, let's implement quantile regression to pinpoint where those carriers fall out so we can recognize and realize where the highest cost carriers are. But use it as a trigger. What the FCC's done, they've actually used it as a tool, and they said, well, because if you are one of the top companies, in the top 10% of the companies in the nation that have high cost, we're just going to disallow those costs. We don't care anything about your service area. We don't care about what type of plant you have. You must be doing something wrong if you fall within that 10%. So they're just going to presumptively disallow cost recovery. That's exactly what they're doing. The other thing that they did was, you know, and this is a little bit troubling, but there's supposed to be transparency in the system. The FCC was supposed to come out with a model or reforms that basically said, hey, we're going to show you what we did and why we did it. But what ended up happening was just the opposite. They put companies in a peer group with other companies. So you might have a company from South Carolina that is in a peer group with a company in New York and California, Alaska. The problem is that you don't know what peer group you're in. You're in some peer group, usually you don't know what it is. So if you go to the FCC and say, hey, how can you possibly compare a company in rural New Mexico with a company in Southern California or something along those lines or whatever? I mean, everybody knows the cost of living in California is typically going to be higher. You can actually do the research to prove that. But they tried to do this one-size-fits-all approach, and it's absolutely not working. It's killing some companies out there, small companies. So you know, some of the similar characteristics that they used: access lines, bedrock, water, road miles, climate. I mean, those type of things where you can say, okay, you know, company A. I mean, you're kind of similar to company B there, but we're going to throw you all in the same group. You can't do that. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why you can't do that. Cost of, like I said, I mean, cost of living in one area is absolutely different than the cost of living in another area. The cost structure in any given state is absolutely different than the cost structure in another state because, you know, each state is specific. And I mean, there's flaws, clear flaws in the order. If I went around to everybody in this room and I said, hey, do you know what is your range of depreciation rates for fiber cable in your state? You know, it's going to be kind of in a range, but it's going to be somewhere between maybe 4% and 6%. But there may not be one company in this room that's going to be exactly the same. But in the quantile regression analysis, the reforms that the FCC did, they basically said, hey, we're going to make it the same. So if a company has a state mandate that says, hey, your depreciation rate has to be this, the FCC is presumptively now disallowing that. And they're saying, no, according to quantile regression now, with these benchmark order, it's going to be this. just like I said, the cost of living in DC or California, I mean, it's clearly not the same as the cost of living in Southwest Kansas. The one-size-fits-all regime, I mean, it's not a workable solution. Every company is different, every state is different. So, yeah, the presumptive disallowance of cost, like I said, this 90th percentile, what the FCC's done, they said, hey, the top 10% of cost in the entire nation, if you're a company that falls within that top 10% threshold, you just have your cost disallowed. It's absolutely disallowed. There's no, that's part of my DART thing, and I'm gonna get into that here at the end of the presentation, because that's one of many things where they just literally threw a dart at a dartboard and said, let's just choose 10%. And we don't know if it's 15%, we don't know if it's 75%. They don't know, but they thought that 10% was the ticket, so that's what they used. Jim talked about the Alaska coefficient. I mean, think about it. It's just absurd. The cost of doing business in Alaska is going to be cheaper than it is, anywhere else in the United States. I mean, come on. Common sense is going to tell you that that's just not the case. On page 2, the last bullet point there under intercarrier compensation, I wanted to briefly get into that. And Jim kind of touched on this briefly. Basically, what the FCC's done, they're saying, okay, they're saying the terminating side of any carrier's network, the terminating side has zero value, and they're going to phase out that cost. So no matter if somebody is calling you from anywhere in the world, then they're saying that incoming call to terminate into your phone from anywhere in the world, that has absolutely no value. And so the FCC is basically phasing out access rates over time. So here's an example of it, like a call, and what access rates really are. I live in Colorado. So if you call me in Colorado and you call from a landline, okay, out of Washington, D.C., your carrier is probably Verizon. Where I live, my carrier is CenturyLink. So what ends up happening is you got one of the bigger carriers like an AT&T or a Verizon or whatever, and they say, okay, the landline company at the origination of the call, we're going to pick up that call, you're going to hand it off to us. We're going to transport that call all the way to Colorado, and we're going to dump it into Doug's phone line. So the carrier that terminates that call on Doug's phone line and the carrier that originates that call out of Washington, D.C., the toll carrier is going to charge you, let's say, 5 cents per minute, 10 cents per minute, something like that. And then they're going to pay the originating carrier 1 cent, maybe the terminating carrier 1 cent, and then they're going to recognize a profit to carry that toll call. So that's the epitome of what we're talking about. And what the FCC is saying is that those access rates, especially when you terminate a call into me in Colorado, it's going down to zero. So after 9 years, there's a 9-year phase out. There is absolutely going to be zero compensation to terminate a phone call. A couple other things here with intercarrier compensation. The FCC froze certain costs. In a nutshell, what's happening is that the FCC, they did absolutely no recognition that a carrier's network is being utilized more than ever. All they said is that, hey, we realize that voice traffic is going down, which they're absolutely correct. But what's that being backfilled with? It's being backfilled with data or video or some bandwidth or something like that. So they said, well, based on that first, analogy of your minutes are going down by, 5 or 10% annually, we're just going to arbitrarily reduce your funding by 5% annually. So here's what that means for the small carrier industry. I mean, that's a $30 million hit for small companies like Jim's and Dennis's and whatnot. I mean, it's a huge deal. So $30 million annual hit there. Like Jim talked about, they got this access recovery charge that is going to be assessed to everybody, all the wireline carriers at 50 cents per wireline per month. They increased the basic local rates to a nationwide benchmark, which is about $14 per month. Many other things that they did. One thing, they actually preempted states for the access rates. If you look at that toll call that that example I just gave, they said, well, hey, as part of this frozen baseline, where we're going to reduce 5% annually, we're going to throw terminating state access into that as well. They didn't have jurisdiction to do that, but they did it. So that's another thing. So there was just thing after thing after thing. here's one thing that's actually really important. I'm on page 3, kind of at the top. The National Broadband Plan is meant for that very thing, to have broadband access universally. So what did the FCC do? They did absolutely nothing. They retained the old USF algorithm that compensates companies for last mile cost. There is absolutely no broadband component in them. So why would they do that? Because it fit into their agenda, apparently. I mean, it was a horrible policy decision. Another thing that when I kind of kicked this thing off a little while ago, universal service was never meant for the larger carriers who have the economies of scale. Small companies with 200 access lines, 1,000 access lines, they don't have the economies of scale. The FCC, and just like Randy talked about, and I think like Jim talked about, the majority of rural customers are in price cap areas. So the FCC, they said, well, hey, we're going to stick in another $1.2 billion annually, and we're going to give it to these larger carriers, but in order to do that, they have to have state-level commitments. So, like Angel talked about, the $775 per line. The larger carrier said, what are you going to require me to do? I don't think so. For $775 in universal service funding, I want nothing to do with that, but they're using it as leverage. Let's be clear about that. I mean, that's exactly what the FCC has allowed them to do. We did an analysis that if they would have taken the $1.8 billion annually, and including the ARC charges and those type of things, in addition to not having to pay access charges phased out over 5 years, there were 7 carriers, including, off the top of my head, Verizon, AT&T, CenturyLink, I think Fairpoint was in there, I think Windstream was in there, there was a couple of others. By charging the additional charges and not having to be assessed the access charges, these carriers are going to get upwards of $9 billion over the next 5 years to the largest of the large carriers. So, many of them, most of them, as a matter of fact, all of them probably publicly traded, so I'm sure they're stockholders like that. So the FCC waiver process, I'll quickly go through that. It's a huge disappointment. Like Jim said, we put together a white paper. We did a lot of research on this. There are approximately 30 pending waivers out there. The FCC just hasn't acted on them. The ones that they did act upon, they offered some type of temporary relief. There was one company recently that got a 1-month relief, like Jim was talking about, 1 month, until the Bureau had the discretion to go in and say, hey, we want to look at your records a little further before we basically allow you any more monies. So there's 28 companies who submitted waiver requests. Out of these, 3 have been provided temporary and interim relief. 5 have been dismissed or denied. The cost of a waiver, that's a point of contention. Sandwich Isles actually testified last week that they spent to date $2 million on their waiver, and the FCC denied every part of it. In totality, got absolutely no relief whatsoever. There were many other companies who testified and provided the record with the support that they spent over $250,000 on a waiver with no relief in sight, and it's been dismissed in some cases. So this waiver is not an outlet. If I'm a company that's being killed, if I want to go into it and try to get an FCC waiver, there's absolutely no guarantee that you're going to get any type of relief. So why would I want to go in and even chance spending $250,000 or more?
Can I comment on that as well?
Sure.
The waiver process has been put in place as a safety valve for the FCC. The true purpose of the waiver should be, as it states, to take care of those companies that are experiencing hardship. But you'll hear the FCC time and time again say there's a waiver. Let them file a waiver when they're testifying before Congress. Anytime they feel the pressure, they refer back to the waiver and say they have a waiver. But we know what happens. The guys that went in, we know what goes on. It's like the school bully that says, give me your lunch money, and then when they're called into the principal's office, it's a whole different story. This is, it sounds a little strange, but this is what we're up against, and this is the main message we'd like to get across. The waiver process is a complete farce, and the reason why you're not getting more companies filing for it is because they know it might cost me $250,000, and at the end of the day, it's going to be denied. And they're not denied for whatever reason the FCC decides. In the case of Dell Telephone, serves 10,500 square miles with 800 customers, 59 miles on the Mexican border with national security issues. Rejected and turned back to the state of Texas to go get your money there first. That's a new requirement. They moved the goalposts, and that's mentioned in Alexicon's study here. This is the kind of, again, the kind of thing we're dealing with. We're just trying to shed some light on it. And we truly believe, if you look at the record, you're really going to, people's eyes are going to be opened up here, and you're going to be scratching your head and thinking about the Alaska example I used and other things like that, because this whole thing is laced with that kind of craziness.
Thanks, Jim. I think what I'm going to do is kind of wrap up here. I mean, basically, so you get the idea of the waiver process. It hasn't worked. It's not working. Companies that have spent hundreds of thousands of millions of dollars have gotten absolutely no relief whatsoever after submitting all of the necessary support and paperwork that they needed to do. On the last page, page number 4, like Jim talked about, we actually have a solution. It's a takeoff. There are some really, really complicated algorithms and formulas and things like that in place. And what we've done is, like I said when I kind of kicked off my presentation here, the old USF algorithm was to compensate companies for last mile facility. Last mile facility is from the central office that serves your home to your home. Okay, I mean, so that includes a copper loop or a fiber loop, that type of thing. What our model does, it's a spin-off of that, where we took that exact algorithm and then we updated it to include broadband categories, so that when companies are compensated in the future via the model that we've set up, they're being compensated for broadband plant, not just last mile facility. It does many other things. It also addresses intercarrier compensation, provides a solution for transitioning access rates to 0. It actually has an offset to the model where the National Exchange Carrier Association, which is this big association that small carriers are members of, that most small carriers are members of in the United States. It actually has an offset where that organization can get some of their cost reduced and thereby offer more competitive pricing out of their tariff. We calculate the model for every company in the nation. It works under a capped fund. There's no gold plating involved. So the bottom line, if a company opts to deploy broadband-capable plant, they will receive compensation versus this presumptive disallowance of cost. So that's how it works. So quickly on the DART. Here's what's going on there. 90th percentile, this quantile regression analysis is based on the top 10% of companies in the nation that are just presumptively disallowed for cost recovery. There's no basis for that. There's no research or nothing. The FCC simply said, well, we think 10%, the top 10% is going to be phased out. $300 million of phase 1 support, there's no support how they came up with that calculation. $50 million of tribal support, there's no support how they came up with that calculation. $3,000 per line, like Angel talked about, they briefly go into, they say, well, they're kind of in the ballpark. I mean, our highest cost companies, that's about what they get. But as far as doing a calculation for that support, there's really no support for that. $1.8 billion for price cap carriers. They go into the order and say they're going to set aside 1.8. Well, we think that's reasonable. That's in the ballpark. $500 million of mobility funding. $500 million of mobility funding. Well, we think that's what wireless carriers should get. There's no basis in their calculations, folks. I mean, what the bottom line is, they pulled a lot of this stuff out of the air. Hey, there's also Commissioner Pai. Commissioner Pai himself said, he said, you know what? He said, why is there a $4.5 billion hard cap on universal service funding? He said, it doesn't have to be that way. He said, maybe it should be, 4.6, 4.7, but there's no mandate to have a $4.5 billion cap. That was something that the commission just came up with. Commissioner Pai himself is against that. He said, you got to treat the companies fairly in accordance with law. You can't just presumptively disallow costs based on your own agenda. So, hey, so in a nutshell, I mean, I know that's a lot of information, a small amount of time, but the bottom line is the order's flawed. We can prove it. We've done our math. We presented numerous white papers and things on the record. So we need your help. We need somebody's help to basically get the attention of Congress or Senate to hold the hearing. That's what Jim's talking about.
And just a couple closing comments. Keep in mind why a lot of this stuff is happening, what the driver is behind what the SCC is doing. Is they came to the conclusion that the small companies are fraudulent, wasteful, and abusive, and you'll see a lot of that in what they say. And then Go back to the employee example that I used. You have an employee, a coworker, who is stealing from the company, taking things from the office and doing all kinds of inappropriate things, and your employer does nothing. Just lets them go, they keep doing their thing. But obviously, I'm comparing that to small companies that may have abused the system, and just like any industry, they've gamed the system. But in this particular case, the FCC or your employer lets this employee go, and then waits for a long period of time after this person it continues to take from the company, steal from the company, and in the end result, you, the good worker who's doing everything you're supposed to do, the final result is everybody gets cracked down on. Everybody gets lumped into this bucket, and nobody's no longer trusted in the rules and regulations that they're standing over your shoulder and treating you as though you did something wrong. That's basically, again, how you may be able to relate to what we're dealing with in the small company industry. And the strategy is the FCC will not do anything unless they feel pressure. Any changes that have been made up to this point is because the coalition like us, the RBA, the associations, the only way things are happening is because there's pressure. They don't want us coming to Congress. They've told us that. Come to us. We'll have 450 meetings with you. We're not listening. You have to have 450 meetings. That tells you somebody's not listening. This is, again, the frustration that we're dealing with. We're talking to people that aren't listening. And if that's the case, we're all wasting our time. And that's why we're coming back to you. We've gone the traditional way. We've tried to make the changes and negotiate through the associations, but it didn't work. We have this terrible order that's being implemented, and that's why we're all now trying to do these different last-ditch efforts here, trying to form a coalition or forming alliances or whatever we're doing to try to get the word out. Again, the issues are complicated, but what's behind it is not. To simplify it, it's about accountability. Nobody in our government gets to do whatever they want. This government represents us. And if we don't take a stand and call people into account, we're going to lose this form of government. That's the bigger issue. It's not all about chasing money around. It's about holding people accountable. That's what this country was built on. If we don't, as citizens, we don't take that duty, not just a right, it's a duty. If we're going to keep this this form of government and pass it down to the next generation. That's the bigger issue here. Now, obviously, to do that, there's some risk. Politicians don't want to do that because they tend to take the less controversial way. Nobody wants to create waves. But we need people to just take a look at the facts. Look at the facts, and how we can do that is call a hearing. And as I said, we're running businesses. We're not professional presenters. We're not professional people running around in this area. How many people in this room come from a rural area? I mean, that your roots are rural. Now, when you're thinking about this issue, then think about your rural communities. That's what we're talking about. Your rural communities are at stake. And we're not talking necessarily right today. That what they've put in place is going to happen over a period of time, 5, 9 years. It's going to happen over time where the broadband network that you have is going to deteriorate and your prices are going to go up. So you're really fighting for your families. If you still have roots back there, that's who you're dealing with.
Let me just ask, this might be a good question for you. One of the things we always try to do is, this is all about, equipping the small business. One thing they need is more competition. They need better speeds, lower prices. That's one of the biggest things with small businesses. But what we have to do is, we have to see all sides and make sure that, we don't cause an issue and see what's there. So who's really against this? Who's against your proposal? I mean, have you brought in the bigger companies, the cables, the wireless, everybody together, maybe sat in a room and talked about a comprehensive plan? I'm just throwing this question out there because a lot of staff are probably going to hear from different groups as well in this issue, and I think it's just good to address kind of the opposition to this, why they're opposed, and then possible next steps.
Well, to tell you the truth, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, we're not really getting any opposition at this point because the large guys got what they wanted. They have their rates are being reduced and they're saving billions of dollars. You don't hear much about the large guys anymore. They've kind of just left us go. They got what they want. The order is being implemented. They're saving their money. And you know what? They're not serving. They're not taking, they're not, as they said, they're leaving money on the table. The only reason why the small guys came into existence is because the big guys didn't want to build those areas. And they still don't want to build those areas. And the FCC gave them the opportunity to do it, and they're declining. They've turned it down because they got what they want. They got the lower rates. And there's no obligation. The order puts all the obligation on the small guys. The big guys got a free pass if they wanted to build these areas. And they were given very low requirements, 4 by 1. If to meet, whatever it was, 6 years or however long, 9 years. We're doing that now in our areas. And if you want these rural areas built, turn to the guys that have done it. Turn to the small guys. They'll build these areas, these underserved, unserved territories. And you're seeing some of that because you got the large guys selling off. And we just had a town hall meeting last week. Some people say, well, you guys are a monopoly. Some people feel that way. No, we're not a monopoly. We're not barring anybody coming into our territory. They don't want to come in our territory. There's not enough profit in that territory. That's why the USF exists. It creates incentive. It's a good program. It works. It should just be thrown out the window now, and now we're left with this crazy system that there's no predictability from one year to the next, and it's just sucked out any incentive to invest.
I'd just like to jump in. First of all, my name's Luke Kale. I work for the Small Company Coalition. I work exclusively on this issue, but I just wanted to say that the model which Doug had been speaking about actually deals exclusively with rate of return regulation. So directly to the question of what sort of resistance will we get with our proposal, I would say none that we can see, because it really just deals with how the money that's currently allocated for our industry, it deals with how it's distributed, and we would say distributed more fairly, but shouldn't step on any toes with the larger carriers. Correct me if I'm wrong, Doug, but
No, I think you're on the right track there, Andy. I mean, my response to that would be that where there's competition, where there's viable competition in any given area, those competitors, they're going to kick and scream. They're going to say, hey, we don't believe in the universal service fund or whatever. I mean, we're talking about carriers that are in the most remote areas of the United States, and the SCC just came in and presumptively disallowed this. Now, one thing that's on the record right now, the SCC just initiated a proceeding where they're basically looking at a forward-looking model. Once again, it's another forward-looking proxy-based model, but it's based on economic theory, which is exactly what quantile regression is based on. It doesn't work. It's never going to work. So the carriers that are going to support that model or whatever, we haven't actually come back and said, hey, you know what, price cap carriers, we don't think that you should look at a forward-looking model. We think that if you want to base on economic theory or competition or whatever, that would be fine. But it clearly doesn't work in our jurisdictions, and the Congress clearly saw that because they specifically have legislation to deal with that. So I don't think your idea is a bad one. I think that if we got price cap carriers and wireless carriers in a room, to kind of negotiate. The problem is that this industry has been hurt badly by doing that very thing. That happened before the order came out, shortly before the order came out, the USF transformation order, they reserved a seat at the table for our industry. And what ended up happening was our industry associations got to this table with those carriers. The carriers said, oh yeah, we're going to carve out this and we're going to do that. And they brought them to the table, and when they actually filed the document with the SCC, I mean, it was a knife in the back type of thing. So the SCC ran with this ABC plan, and then it was all over. I mean, then it was a really bad deal. That's happened a couple of times before. I don't necessarily think it's a bad idea to maybe talk to some of those folks or whatever, but past history has proven that it's just not a good idea. And since rate of return regulation is based on primarily, USF is based on Section 254 of the Act, I mean, that's what it's set aside for. And we actually have the solution for that.
Andy,